The hangar lights hummed against the corrugated steel roof, and 41 engineers stood in a loose, defeated half-circle around a $200 million aircraft that refused to breathe. Natalie Prescott stood apart from them, arms crossed over a blazer that had not been designed for standing in a freezing hangar at 6 in the morning, watching the last of Pinnacle Atlantic Aviation's contracted specialists shake his head and step back from the open engine cowling like it had personally offended him. Somewhere behind her, a junior mechanic in a faded gray jumpsuit cleared his throat, and the sound was so small, so apologetic, that 3 people turned before they even registered why. Tyler Brooks raised one hand, not high, not dramatic, just enough to be seen, and asked if he could take a look. A ripple of laughter went through the group. Not cruel exactly, just the particular contempt reserved for a man in a $200 toolkit standing next to 41 men in 6-figure diagnostic rigs. Natalie didn't laugh. She looked at him the way she looked at contracts she hadn't finished reading yet, and said, "Fine, 4 minutes. Then we're done here." Tyler set his bag down without a word, knelt beside the cowling, and reached into a gap no one else had thought to check. And when his fingers found what they were looking for, something inside the assembly gave a small distinct click, like a bone sliding back into its socket. To find out how a widowed mechanic from a regional airport nobody had heard of ended up saving the most expensive aircraft in Natalie Prescott's fleet, and what it cost both of them by the end of it, stay until the very end. If stories like this speak to you, the ones about people everyone stopped looking at, who turn out to be exactly the ones you needed all along, we'd love to hear it in the comments below, because so many of you watching have lived some version of this yourselves. There's a particular kind of ache in watching a room full of credentialed men fail at something a quiet, overlooked man solves in minutes. And it raises the same old question that never quite goes away. Should real responsibility go to the person with the diploma on the wall, or the person with 30 years of grease under his fingernails? 3 years ago, none of this existed. There was no hangar full of failed engineers, no $1 million bet, no Natalie Prescott standing in the cold at 6 in the morning. There was only a small airport 40 minutes outside of Asheville, a 9-year-old boy named Owen, who ate his cereal dry because he liked the crunch, and a man who had once been one of the best aircraft systems engineers in the country, and who now spent his days fixing single-engine Cessnas for retired dentists and crop-dusting outfits that paid him in cash and gratitude. Tyler Brooks had not always been invisible. 6 years earlier, he had been the lead propulsion systems engineer at Halden Aerospace, a name that once meant something in the private aviation world before it was quietly absorbed into a larger conglomerate and its brightest people scattered like buckshot. Tyler had been good, not flashy good, not conference keynote good, but the kind of good that shows up in the numbers nobody looks at until something breaks. He had a wife then, Marin, a pediatric nurse with a laugh that filled up whatever room she was in, and a boy who was 3 years old and just beginning to understand that his father's hands could fix almost anything. And then Marin got sick, fast and cruel the way these things sometimes are. And by the time Tyler surfaced from 18 months of hospital rooms and hospice paperwork and a funeral he barely remembered attending, Halden Aerospace had restructured twice. His old position no longer existed, and nobody had thought to call him. He never told anyone at his new, smaller life exactly what he had walked away from. He told himself it didn't matter, that the only job that mattered now was Owen, was making sure there was cereal in the cabinet and someone at the bus stop and a light on at night. He took the maintenance job at the regional airport because it was steady, because it let him leave by 4 most days, and because nobody there asked him to explain the 6-year gap in his resume, where his whole life had quietly ended, and then more quietly begun again. Natalie Prescott, meanwhile, was 3 states away and building something that looked, from the outside, like triumph. She had taken over Pinnacle Atlantic Aviation from her father 4 years earlier, at 34, inheriting a mid-tier private aviation company. With an aging fleet and a board that treated her competence as a rounding error next to her last name, she had spent every one of those 4 years proving them wrong, through sheer force of will, closing contracts other CEOs would have walked away from, expanding the fleet, and finally landing the deal that was supposed to cement her legacy for good. A $200 million next-generation aircraft, the Pinnacle Meridian, commissioned as the flagship of a fleet expansion that would triple the company's charter contracts with 3 of the largest logistics and executive travel firms on the East Coast. The Meridian was supposed to make its unveiling flight in 11 days, in front of the board, the press, and the CEOs of all 3 client companies. 60 jobs at Pinnacle's Charlotte facility depended on that contract closing. Natalie's own position, though she would never have said this out loud to a single person on her staff, depended on it too. Her father still sat on the board. He had not said he was watching her closely. He didn't need to. The man responsible for the Meridian's final systems integration was Pinnacle's newly hired Chief Engineering Officer, Marcus Doyle, a smooth, charismatic 38-year-old who had come over from a much larger competitor, with a resume so polished it practically had a shine to it, and who had a talent, Natalie would later understand, for being in the room when things went right and elsewhere when they went wrong. Marcus had personally signed off on the Meridian's engine and hydraulic integration 8 weeks earlier. He had used words like redundancy verified and diagnostic clean in the report he handed Natalie. The kind of confident corporate language that made problems sound like they had already been solved simply by naming them. And so when the Meridian sat cold and silent in the hangar 4 days before its scheduled test flight, refusing to hold ignition for reasons that 41 of the best contracted aviation engineers on the eastern seaboard could not diagnose, Marcus Doyle stood at Natalie's shoulder with his arms folded and his voice steady, and told her it had to be a manufacturing defect, something upstream, something that was absolutely, categorically not a failure of his integration work. Natalie had believed him, because she needed to believe someone, and because doubting him meant doubting her own judgment in hiring him 8 months earlier over 4 other candidates, one of whom, though she did not know this yet and would not learn it for months, had once been a name Marcus recognized from a program at Halden Aerospace and had quietly, deliberately made sure never made it past the first round. By the 3rd day, with the unveiling 5 days out, and the aircraft still dead in the hangar, Natalie made the announcement that would ripple out across 2 industry trade publications, and, eventually, straight into a small regional airport she had never heard of. $1 million, publicly offered, to any engineer or technician who could diagnose and repair the Meridian before the unveiling flight. It was equal parts genuine desperation and calculated theater, a woman refusing to let her legacy aircraft die quietly, forcing the industry to watch her fight for it instead. Reporters called it a stunt. Her father called it reckless. Marcus Doyle, standing beside her when she made the call to the trade press, smiled the small, contained smile of a man who did not believe anyone was coming, and who had every reason, if anyone ever did dig deep enough into the Meridian's hydraulic control assembly, to hope that they never found what he had left there. 11 days would pass between that phone call and the moment a widowed mechanic from a small airport in the mountains would kneel down beside the Meridian's open cowling and reach for something. No one else had thought to check. The 41 engineers who came through Pinnacle's Charlotte hangar over those 11 days were not incompetent men. They were, by any reasonable measure, excellent. Men and women with advanced degrees from programs that took names like Georgia Tech and Purdue seriously. Men who had spent careers on exactly this class of aircraft. They ran diagnostics that took hours and cost tens of thousands of dollars in specialized equipment rental. They replaced sensors, recalibrated the fuel flow computer, pulled and reseated 3 separate control modules, and each time, the Meridian sat there afterward exactly as dead as it had been before, its twin engines refusing to hold past a half-second of ignition before shutting themselves down in what the aircraft's own systems insisted, again and again, was a catastrophic hydraulic pressure fault that no one could locate. Natalie watched each failure from the same spot near the hangar door, arms crossed, jaw tight, doing the math in her head that she would not say out loud to anyone. 5 days left, then 4, then 3, while Marcus Doyle stood beside her offering theories that sounded increasingly desperate, dressed up as increasingly confident. It was on the 8th day, with 3 days left before the unveiling, and the aircraft still silent, that Natalie made the decision that would humiliate a man she had never met, and, though she couldn't have known it yet, would eventually become the thing she was most ashamed of in her professional life. A junior staffer, hunting for any lead at all, had put out feelers to smaller regional facilities across 3 states, on the theory that some of the older generation mechanics who'd worked the previous generation of pinnacle aircraft might spot something the newer specialists were missing. Tyler Brooks's name came back attached to a note that said, essentially, worked at Howden Aerospace years ago, does maintenance at a small airport now, seems sharp. Natalie had him flown in without much thought, one name among 6 on a short list that afternoon, and when Tyler walked into the hangar in the same gray jumpsuit he wore every day of his working life, carrying a toolkit that looked like it had survived 2 decades of actual use rather than sitting in a display case, Marcus Doyle looked him over once, top to bottom, and made a small comment to the 2 engineers standing nearest him. Something about hoping this one brought his own coffee, since he clearly wasn't billing $400 an hour. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. The laugh that followed traveled exactly as far as it needed to, and Tyler heard every bit of it and said nothing, because he had spent 6 years learning that saying nothing was the only kind of dignity a man in his position got to keep. Natalie, for her part, barely looked at him. She was 3 days from watching 60 jobs and a decade of proving herself evaporate, and a mechanic from an airport she'd never heard of registered in that moment as background noise. When Tyler asked, quietly, whether he could look at the hydraulic control assembly, rather than run the same electronic diagnostics everyone else had already run twice, Natalie gave the request maybe 4 seconds of real attention before Marcus cut in, smooth and reasonable, saying they'd already ruled out the hydraulics, that the fault code pointed upstream, that they didn't have time to relitigate settled ground. Natalie nodded, because Marcus's voice had the particular calm authority of a man who sounded like he knew what he was talking about, and because doubting him again would have meant doubting herself again, and she had run out of that particular currency days ago. Tyler was thanked, given a modest per diem for his travel, and sent home. He said nothing on the drive to the airport. He said nothing on the flight back. Owen asked him that night, over dinner, how the big important job had gone, and Tyler told him it hadn't worked out, and left it there, the way he left most things about his old life there, folded small and put away, where a 9-year-old wouldn't have to carry the weight of it. What none of them knew, not Natalie, not Marcus, not the 41 engineers who had by then cycled through the hangar twice, was that the fault had nothing to do with the systems everyone kept testing, and everything to do with a single hydraulic line fitting that Marcus Doyle himself had personally approved during final integration 8 weeks earlier. A fitting installed a quarter turn short of full torque by a rushed subcontractor crew working a compressed schedule Marcus had signed off on to save 9 days and roughly $400,000 in labor costs. It was the kind of error that would never show up on an electronic diagnostic, because the fitting held pressure perfectly well at rest, and only failed, catastrophically and silently, under the specific thermal expansion that occurred in the first 90 seconds of ignition, which meant every single test the 41 engineers ran sitting cold, powered down. Methodically checking sensors and modules was checking exactly the wrong thing, because Marcus had steered every diagnostic conversation firmly upstream, away from the one system he needed no one to examine too closely. Now, this is where a story like this tends to split people right down the middle in the comments, and we'd genuinely like to know where you land. There's a version of this where you say, Tyler should have pushed harder in that hangar, should have said something louder, should have refused to just nod and go home quietly when he knew, in his gut, exactly where the problem was. And there's another version where you understand that a man with a 9-year-old son at home, a man who had already lost everything else that mattered to him once, simply could not afford to make an enemy of a chief engineering officer over a hunch, not when speaking up too loudly, too soon, had cost men like him their careers before. Was silence the only way to protect what he had left, or was it the very thing that let the real problem stay buried 3 more days? That's a question this story is going to keep circling back to. The Meridian sat dead in the hangar for 2 more days. On the eve of the unveiling, with reporters already confirmed, with the CEOs of all 3 client companies scheduled to arrive by 10 the next morning, Natalie Prescott stood alone in that hangar after everyone else had gone home, looking up at $200 million of silent aircraft, and made the kind of decision people make only when they have exhausted every reasonable option. She picked up her phone, scrolled back through the shortlist from 3 days earlier, and looked, for the first time with any real attention, at the name she had dismissed in 4 seconds. 3 days would pass before she picked up that phone. It would be 3 more days before anyone in that hangar understood what had actually happened to the Meridian. And by the time they did, the man who could fix it would already be walking back out the door, refusing the $1 million everyone assumed he'd come for. Natalie did not sleep the night before the unveiling. She sat in her office on the top floor of Pinnacle's headquarters, with the lights off, the city spread out beneath her, in the particular indifferent glitter of a place that had no idea her career was quietly dying 4 floors above a parking garage. And she went back through the file on Tyler Brooks that the junior staffer had assembled a week earlier. Not the 4-second glance she'd given it in the hangar, but a real read. Halden Aerospace, lead propulsion systems engineer, 6 years of commendations, 2 patents filed jointly with the team he'd led. And then, abruptly, nothing. No resume gap explanation. No LinkedIn update. Just a clean 6-year silence before the words maintenance technician. Regional airfield showed up like a man had simply stepped off the edge of his own career and never climbed back on. She noticed something else too, something that snagged at her the way a loose thread does. A small buried note from the junior staffer's outreach call, almost an afterthought, mentioning that Tyler had specifically asked, during his brief visit, whether they'd checked the hydraulic fitting torque on the number 2 engine assembly, and had been told by Marcus that the question wasn't relevant. Natalie read that line 4 times. It was 2 in the morning. Something cold and unfamiliar was starting to move through her, a feeling less like suspicion and more like the early, sick recognition of having trusted the wrong voice in a room. She was not the only one lying awake with pieces of this puzzle. Elena Vasquez, a soft-spoken systems analyst who had been on Marcus Doyle's integration team for the Meridian project, had spent 8 weeks watching her boss make small, confident decisions that she'd quietly disagreed with and never said so. Because Marcus had a way of making disagreement feel like disloyalty, and because Elena, 2 years out of graduate school and carrying student loans that kept her up at night in a different way, could not afford to be the junior analyst who made an enemy of the chief engineering officer. She had seen the subcontractor crew rush the final hydraulic assembly. She had flagged, in a private note to herself that she never sent to anyone, that the torque verification on that final integration pass looked lighter than the spec sheet called for. She had told herself it was probably fine, that Marcus had signed off, that it wasn't her place. But she had not been able to stop thinking about it in the 8 days since the meridian went dark. And on the night before the unveiling, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold, Elena finally opened her laptop and pulled the archived torque verification logs from that final assembly pass, and sat looking at a number that was exactly a quarter turn short of spec, and felt something in her stomach drop straight through the floor. Natalie called Tyler Brooks at 6:40 the next morning, 90 minutes before the client CEOs were scheduled to land. She did not lead with an apology. She would tell herself later that this was one of her genuine regrets from that whole strange week, that she led with the ask before she led with the acknowledgement. But she asked him directly, no theater in her voice this time, whether he still believed it was the hydraulic assembly, and whether he'd be willing to come back and prove it, this time without anyone standing over his shoulder telling him where he wasn't allowed to look. Tyler was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Owen was still asleep down the hall. Tyler thought about the 4 seconds of attention he'd gotten in that hangar a week earlier, about the small laugh that had traveled exactly as far as it needed to, about how easy it would have been to say no. He had a full schedule at the regional airport. Other people's fixed positions were not his emergency. But there was something in the tired, stripped-down honesty of Natalie's voice that he recognized from somewhere further back than this phone call, some old, worn-in respect for a person willing to admit out loud that they'd gotten something wrong. He told her he'd come. He told his supervisor at the regional airport it was a family matter. He did not tell Owen anything at all, because there was nothing yet worth telling a 9-year-old. And because Tyler had learned a long time ago not to promise his son anything he wasn't certain he could deliver. Here is where this story touches something a lot of you will recognize, and it's worth sitting with for a second. There's a real tension between the value of corporate loyalty, showing up, doing the job in front of you, trusting the system to eventually see what you're worth, and the plain, uncomfortable truth that companies forget, with startling speed, exactly who it was that built the thing they're now taking credit for. Tyler had given Halden Aerospace 6 years of some of his best engineering work, and when tragedy pulled him under, the company didn't reach a hand down to pull him back up. It simply moved on, the way institutions do, and left him to rebuild something smaller and quieter on his own. Whether that's the fair cost of how large organizations function, or something closer to a betrayal dressed up in corporate language, is exactly the kind of thing people don't agree on, and we'd love to hear which side of it you land on. Elena arrived at the hangar before Marcus did that morning, and instead of going to her boss first, she went straight to Natalie's office, laptop open, torque verification log pulled up on the screen, hand shaking slightly as she explained what she'd found and what it meant. And, haltingly, that she should have said something 8 days earlier and hadn't. Because she'd been afraid, Natalie did not raise her voice. She thanked Elena, told her that speaking up now, even late, took more courage than staying silent the whole way through would have, and asked her to keep the log open and ready. Marcus Doyle walked into the hangar 40 minutes later, tie straight, voice already warming up for the press that would be arriving within the hour, and found Natalie Prescott standing beside a gray jumpsuited mechanic he recognized from 8 days earlier, both of them looking at him with an expression he did not yet understand but would, within the next several hours, come to understand completely. A single secondary crisis was still unfolding in the background that morning that none of them could see yet. The lead client CEO's travel team had already begun quietly asking Pinnacle's PR office pointed questions about the delay, questions that, if not answered convincingly, within the hour, threatened to collapse the deal regardless of whether the aircraft ever started. 90 minutes remained before the hangar doors would open to the press, the clients, and a truth that had been sitting 3 inches inside a hydraulic assembly for 8 weeks, waiting for someone willing to actually kneel down and look. Tyler walked the length of the Meridian's open cowling once, slowly, the way a man walks a room he's about to make an argument in, and then knelt exactly where he'd asked to kneel 8 days earlier and been waved away from. He did not run a diagnostic scan. He did not call for a laptop or a technician or anyone to hold a light. He reached into the gap between the number 2 engine's hydraulic manifold and the surrounding housing, felt along the primary fitting with 2 fingers the way a man reads Braille, and found it within 11 seconds. A coupling that should have taken a full quarter turn of resistance under his hand and instead gave way with almost nothing. Loose enough that under cold, static conditions it held pressure just fine, but under the specific thermal expansion of active ignition, would flex open by a fraction of a millimeter, just enough to bleed hydraulic pressure at exactly the threshold that would trip the engine's automatic shutdown half a second into every start. He explained this once quietly to Natalie and to the small cluster of engineers who had gathered by then. Not with jargon, not with performance, just the plain mechanics of it. A rushed installation, a fitting torqued to maybe 70% of spec instead of full spec, invisible to every cold diagnostic, because the failure only existed in motion, in heat. In the 90 seconds, nobody had thought to actually watch closely, because every instrument in the building was built to check numbers at rest, not behavior in flight. He pulled a torque wrench from his own bag, the same worn toolkit Marcus had made a small joke about 8 days earlier, seated the fitting properly, brought it to full spec in under 2 minutes, and stepped back. Natalie gave the order to attempt ignition. The hangar went silent in the specific way a room goes silent when 40 people are all holding the same breath at once, and then the Meridian's twin engines caught, held, and rose into a clean, steady roar that didn't cut out at the half-second mark, didn't cut out at 5 seconds, didn't cut out at all, just settled into the low, continuous power of an aircraft finally completely alive. 4 minutes and 11 seconds had passed since Tyler knelt down. Someone near the back of the hangar actually applauded before catching themselves. Natalie didn't move for a full 3 seconds, standing there with her hand pressed flat against her sternum, like she was checking that her own heart was still working. And then she turned, not toward the aircraft, but toward Marcus Doyle, and asked him, in a voice gone very quiet and very even, why a man from a small regional airport had known in 4 minutes something 41 contracted specialists and 8 days of diagnostics had missed entirely. Marcus tried for about 90 seconds to hold the same ground he'd held for 8 days. Theories about manufacturing tolerances, about how anyone could get lucky, checking a system nobody else had prioritized. It was Elena who ended it, stepping forward with her laptop still open, turning the screen so Natalie could see the archived torque log from the final integration pass 8 weeks earlier, a number that matched, almost to the decimal, the exact under-tightened measurement Tyler had just pulled by hand from the actual fitting. Marcus had signed that log himself. His name was on it in a digital signature timestamp that could not be argued with the way his voice could. The compressed subcontractor schedule, the $400,000 saved, the 9 days shaved off a deadline he'd been under real pressure to hit, all of it sat there in black and white, and the polished, reasonable calm that had carried Marcus Doyle through 8 days of confident misdirection finally, visibly, cracked. He did not shout. He did not deny it outright. He simply stopped talking, which in a hangar that had gone dead silent except for the low idle of 2 working engines, said everything that needed saying. What struck Natalie most, watching all of this unfold, was not the mechanical failure itself, though that alone would have ended Marcus's tenure at Pinnacle. It was the precision of what Tyler had just done. The specific, unhurried competence of a man who clearly knew this aircraft systems at a level none of the newer, more credentialed specialists had matched in 8 full days, and who had done it without once raising his voice, without gloating, without so much as glancing toward Marcus, in whatever satisfaction a lesser man might have allowed himself in that moment. He had simply fixed it, explained it plainly, and stepped back the same way he'd stepped back 8 days earlier when he was laughed out of the room. There is something in that particular restraint that a lot of viewers over the years have told us reminds them of someone in their own life. A father, a grandfather, a mentor, someone who never needed the room to know how good they were, because being good was never really about the room in the first place. And that quiet contrast, an older mechanic's decades of hands-on instinct succeeding exactly where a younger engineer's formal credentials and expensive diagnostic equipment had failed for over a week, is worth sitting with for a second, because it's the kind of thing that tends to split a comment section right down the middle. Some of you will say experience like Tyler's should always be trusted first, and others will say it's not that simple, that both kinds of knowledge matter, and the real failure here was Marcus's arrogance, not the diagnostic method itself. The client CEOs arrived 40 minutes later to a hangar that had, in the span of a single chaotic hour, gone from catastrophe to triumph, and Natalie made the decision on the spot, without consulting a single member of her PR team, to tell them the truth, not a sanitized version, but the actual sequence of events, including the 8 days lost to a chief engineering officer's cover-up and the mechanic who'd solved it in 4 minutes once someone finally let him. It was a risk. It could have unraveled the deal entirely. Instead, the lead client CEO, a weathered logistics executive who had built his own company up from 3 delivery trucks, listened to the whole account with his arms folded and then said, simply, that he'd rather do business with a company willing to say that out loud than one that would have buried it. The deal held. Marcus Doyle was walked out of the building before lunch, his employment terminated for cause, the full torque log and its implications quietly forwarded to Pinnacle's legal team for further review. Natalie offered Tyler the $1 million on the spot, in front of everyone, a check already being drafted by her assistant before Tyler had even fully wiped the hydraulic fluid off his hands. He turned it down. What he asked for instead, in the same quiet, unhurried voice he'd used to explain the fitting, would leave Natalie standing in that hangar for a long moment, genuinely unable to answer him right away. And it would take another 6 months, and a great deal neither of them expected, before either of them understood exactly what that request was going to cost, and give them both what Tyler asked for. Standing in a hangar full of engineers and executives, and a hydraulic fluid stain slowly spreading across the knee of his jumpsuit, was not a title, not a signing bonus, not even a public acknowledgement. He asked for steady work, enough hours, at a fair rate, to let him give notice at the regional airport without leaving his old supervisor short-staffed, and enough flexibility in the schedule that he could still be home most nights by 6, because that was the hour Owen liked to be read to, and Tyler had missed exactly 0 of those nights in the 4 years since Myrn died, and had no intention of starting now for $1 million or anything else. Natalie stood there for a long moment, genuinely thrown, because in 4 years of running Pinnacle, she had negotiated 8-figure contracts, with less hesitation than this man was showing over a bedtime story. And something about that stopped her cold in a way the whole catastrophe of the Meridian hadn't quite managed. She offered him the $1 million anyway, separate from the job, simply because he'd earned it, and because turning it down struck her as its own kind of stubbornness that didn't need rewarding with more stubbornness. Tyler eventually agreed to a smaller amount, enough to put fully away for Owen's education and nothing more, and accepted a position as chief technical advisor, a title he wore about as comfortably as a borrowed suit, showing up every day in the same gray jumpsuit he'd always worn, to the quiet, ongoing bewilderment of Pinnacle's more image-conscious staff. The public reckoning happened 3 weeks later, at Pinnacle's rescheduled unveiling, held this time, not just for the original 3 client companies, but for the full trade press that had smelled a story the moment word of Marcus Doyle's termination leaked. Natalie stood at the podium in front of the very same hangar and told the whole account without flinching. The failure, the cover-up, the 8 days lost, and the mechanic who fixed in 4 minutes what 41 specialists couldn't touch in 8 days, because he was the only one in the building anyone had bothered to actually listen to when it mattered. She asked Tyler to join her at the podium. He came up reluctantly, said almost nothing beyond a brief, genuine thank you, and stepped back into the crowd within 90 seconds, visibly more comfortable, a wingtip away from a jet engine than a microphone. It was, several trade reporters noted afterward, the most unusual and oddly moving executive announcement any of them had covered that year. A CEO publicly owning a catastrophic failure of judgment, and a man who could have humiliated an entire industry's worth of credentialed engineers choosing, instead, to just go quietly back to work. Over the following months, something neither of them had planned for took shape in the ordinary friction of working closely together. Natalie found herself, more than once, staying late, not because a deadline demanded it, but because Tyler was still in the hangar, walking a junior technician through a repair, explaining something with the same patient, unhurried clarity he used with Owen at the kitchen table. And she realized she was watching, not out of professional interest, but because there was something in that stillness she hadn't encountered in years of boardrooms full of people performing competence, rather than simply having it. Tyler, for his part, began noticing that Natalie asked about Owen before she asked about deliverables, remembered which Tuesdays were pizza night, and once, without being asked, cleared her own calendar to attend Owen's 4th grade science fair when Tyler mentioned, almost as an aside, that Owen had built a small model jet engine and desperately wanted someone from a real aviation company to see it. She stood in a school gymnasium in a blazer entirely wrong for the setting, crouched down to Owen's height, and asked him 3 careful, genuine questions about airflow that made his whole face light up, and Tyler, watching from a few feet away, understood in that particular unguarded moment that this woman valued something in his son that had nothing at all to do with what she could get from his father. They did not rush anything. Natalie's board, once they'd absorbed the shock of the Meridian scandal and the surprisingly favorable press it generated, watched their CEO's growing closeness with her chief technical advisor, with the kind of interest boards always take in anything that might become a liability, and Natalie, to her own quiet surprise, found she no longer cared nearly as much what they thought as she once had. 6 months after the unveiling, she turned down a much larger, much more prestigious offer to merge Pinnacle into a national conglomerate, a deal that would have made her personally wealthy beyond anything her father had ever managed, because the terms required cutting the Charlotte facility's workforce by 40%, the very jobs the Meridian contract had been meant to protect in the first place. And Tyler's own quiet, steady presence in her life over those months had taught her something about what kind of cost was actually worth paying, and what wasn't. It cost her the board's confidence for a while. It cost her briefly the easy admiration of a business press that liked its CEOs bold and consolidating. She was rewarded for it anyway, in the way that matters longer than headlines do. The Charlotte facility stayed open, 60 families kept their jobs, and Tyler Brooks, watching all of it unfold from the same hangar where he'd once been laughed at, found himself standing beside a woman who had chosen the harder, quieter right thing over the easier, showier one, the same way he had, all those years ago, chosen his son over everything else the world had once promised him. The quiet coda came on an ordinary Tuesday 9 months after the Meridian first roared back to life. In that same hangar, empty now except for the two of them and Owen, who had been allowed to come along after school and was crouched beside the very fitting his father had once repaired in 4 minutes, running his fingers along the metal the way he'd watched his dad do 100 times at the kitchen table with smaller engines. Natalie stood beside Tyler, watching the boy work with the same unhurried focus his father brought to everything, and asked quietly whether Tyler ever thought about what his life would have looked like if he'd taken some flashier company's offer instead of a maintenance job at a tiny regional airport 6 years earlier. Tyler thought about it for a moment, watched his son turn a small wrench with careful, serious hands, and said that he didn't think real worth ever had much to do with the size of the company on your business card or the number of letters after your name, but with whether the people who actually needed you could count on you showing up. Natalie didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She just stood there in the quiet hangar, watching a 9-year-old boy with his father's hands, and understood completely what he meant. If there's one thing this story keeps circling back to, it's this. So many of us walk through our own lives quietly underestimated, dismissed in 4 seconds by someone too busy or too certain to actually look at what we're carrying. And it can start to feel like the world has simply decided who you are and closed the file. But worth was never really about who's watching, or who's applauding, or which room you're allowed into. It was always about what you do when nobody's counting on you to do anything at all. The 4 minutes you spend kneeling down when everyone else has already walked away. The bedtime story you never miss. The small, steady thing you keep doing, even when no one's handing out $1,000,000 checks for it. If you believe people like Tyler, the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, deserve to be truly seen, we'd love for you to stay part of this story with us and subscribe, because we've got more of these waiting, and we think you'll want to be here for them. And if you're wondering what finally became of that first offer Natalie made him in the hangar, the one Tyler almost didn't take, stay close, because there's one more truth about that morning neither of them told anyone for a long, long time.